Millions laughed at a black child they refused to treat as human. Hollywood took a 14-month-old boy and erased his gender. They shoved him into a tattered dress, wired his hair upright in perpetual panic, and threw him to dogs for a punchline. The world knew him as Farina. The public called it comedy. In reality, it was a multi-million-dollar hostage situation. This is the unvarnished truth of Alan Hoskins, the abused toddler who built an American television empire only to be systematically erased the exact moment he dared to grow into a man. The transformation of a child into a commodity began with the era of his birth. The year is 1920. The United States is entering a decade of explosive wealth, jazz, and industrial boom. But this prosperity is guarded by high invisible walls. Alan Hoskins is born in Boston, but his family soon moves to Los Angeles. They are stepping into a society strictly governed by the rules of Jim Crow. This is not just a set of legal statutes regarding where you can eat or sit on a bus. It is an entire atmosphere of subjugation. It is a psychological framework that dictates exactly how much space a black person is allowed to occupy in the world. For a black family in Los Angeles in the early 1920s, economic survival is a daily grinding reality. The avenues for advancement are tightly choked off. Individuals were either invisible, performing menial labor, or highly visible only in the specific humiliating roles the dominant culture allowed them to play. This is the fatal vulnerability that the Hollywood system feeds on. The studios do not need to use physical force to capture their subjects. They use the crushing weight of economic desperation. The Hal Roach studio is operating a massive comedy assembly line. They are churning out short films at a staggering pace. Hal Roach has a revolutionary idea for a new series. He wants to film children just being children. He calls it Our Gang. On the surface, it is a progressive concept. He wants a diverse cast. He wants kids of different backgrounds playing together on screen. But the reality behind the studio gates is violently different from the utopian image projected on the screen. In this era, the film industry operates in a regulatory vacuum. There are no robust child labor laws protecting young actors. There are no limits on hours, no mandatory schooling on set, and absolutely no psychological safeguards. A child on a studio lot in 1922 is legally and practically considered a piece of rented equipment. They are raw material. If a white child actor is vulnerable in this environment, a black child actor is entirely defenseless. They have no union, no legal recourse, and no social standing to complain. Alan Hoskins is brought to the Hal Roach studio when he is just 14 months old. He cannot speak. He cannot walk steadily. He has no concept of what a camera is, let alone a contract. Stripping away the romanticized magic of early cinema reveals a brutal reality. Why does a family hand over a toddler to a film crew? It is the desperate hope for financial stability. The studio offers money that is impossible to earn elsewhere. It is a survival mechanism. The parents are making a calculation based on the brutal mathematics of their reality. They believe they are stepping into an opportunity. They do not realize the door is locking behind them. The studio executives look at the 14-month-old infant. They see that he is photogenic. They see that his reactions are natural and amusing. But they do not see Alan Hoskins. They immediately recognize that a normal, healthy, black infant does not fit the narrative they want to sell to white America. The public does not want to see black children as equal ordinary participants in the American dream. The public wants to be entertained by their supposed inferiority. Hal Roach and his writers know exactly what to do. They have an entire history of theatrical racism to draw from. They look at this baby and decide that his natural existence is a flaw that must be corrected. They realize that to maximize the comedic value of this child, they must strip him of his basic human dignity from the very beginning. The strategy is cold, calculated, and brilliant in its cruelty. They are going to build a character that is less than human, a creature that exists solely to be the butt of the joke. This requires a total aesthetic and psychological overhaul of the child. It is not enough to just give him funny lines. They have to alter his fundamental presentation to the world. They recognize that an audience's pity or empathy is dangerous to comedy. If the audience sees Alan as a real boy, they might feel uncomfortable when bad things happen to him on screen. Therefore, Alan must be removed from the equation. The transformation begins in the wardrobe department. This is not a place of creative costuming. It is an assembly line for stereotypes. When a child actor of European descent sits in the chair, the studio enhances their natural features. They make the boys look like mischievous but ultimately respectable young gentlemen. They make the girls look like porcelain dolls. But when Alan Hoskins is placed in that same chair, the objective is entirely different. The studio does not want to enhance his humanity. They want to erase it. They decide that the most effective way to render this child harmless, funny, and utterly subhuman to a white audience is to strip him of his gender. Alan is a boy. His anatomy is male. His parents are raising him as a son. But Hal Roach and his directors make a calculated decision. They invent a character named Farina. The name itself is a brand of hot cereal, an inanimate object, an agricultural product. It is not a human name, and the entity known as Farina is deliberately designed to be genderless. They put the toddler in dresses, not clean, well-tailored dresses that a wealthy girl might wear, but tattered, stained, formless smocks made of cheap gingham. The fabric hangs loosely on his small frame, completely obscuring his physical reality. They are putting him in a uniform of poverty and confusion. Then comes the hair. This is perhaps the most iconic and insidious visual element of the abuse. The studio stylists take the young boy's natural hair and twist it tightly into dozens of small, stiff pigtails. They use string or wire to make these pigtails stand straight up in the air. Imagine the physical discomfort of a toddler having their hair pulled tight against the scalp, day after day, bound with foreign materials to defy gravity. It is a visual representation of constant electric panic. The hair is designed to make him look perpetually frightened, wild, and utterly ridiculous. It is a physical manifestation of a racial slur. This visual assault is paired with a psychological one. On the set, the adults in charge, the directors, the cameramen, the producers, enforce this gender confusion constantly. The scripts are written with a deliberate mocking inconsistency. In one short film, the title cards will refer to Farina as he. In the very next film, or sometimes even within the same scene, they will call him she. They refer to him as it. This is not an accident. This is a highly sophisticated form of psychological warfare against a developing mind. The studio is telling millions of people that this black child is so insignificant, so far beneath the rigid social structures of polite society, that he does not even warrant a definitive biological identity. The daily reality for Alan during these formative years was deeply destabilizing. A child's understanding of self is built between the ages of 1 and 5. It is constructed through how the world reacts to them. For Alan, his reality is shattered every time he enters the studio gates. At home, he is a son. On the lot, he is a thing. He is shoved into ragged dresses. He is yelled at by grown men who call him she while pointing and laughing. He is instructed to act confused, to cry, to widen his eyes in exaggerated terror. He is not acting. He is being subjected to stimuli designed to provoke a genuine trauma response. The camera simply captures the abuse and packages it as comedy. This specific humiliation was not an accident. It was rooted in the ugly machinery of American racial politics. By removing Alan's masculinity, they removed any future threat he might represent. In the racist imagination of the 1920s, a strong, growing black male was a figure of fear and anxiety. By turning him into a genderless, tattered clown, the studio neutralized that fear. They offered the white audience a comforting lie. They said, "Look at this creature. It is harmless. It is foolish. It does not even know what it is. You do not need to treat it with respect because it is not entirely human." This exact visual and psychological profile is not a spontaneous invention of the Hal Roach writers. It is the precise application of the Pickaninny caricature. The Pickaninny was a dominant racist trope in American culture, dating back to the days of chattel slavery and minstrel shows. It was a standardized, mass-produced image of black children. The rules of the caricature were strict. The child must be dark-skinned. They must have bulging eyes. They must have unkempt, wild hair. They must wear ragged, oversized clothing. They must be depicted in natural, dirty environments, eating watermelons, sitting in the dirt, or being chased by dangerous animals. The purpose of the Pickaninny stereotype was deeply political. It was designed to suggest that black children were impervious to pain, that they did not need the care, education, or protection that white children required. It portrayed them as feral animals that belonged in the mud, not in a classroom. When audiences laughed at a Pickaninny character being kicked, chased by dogs, or falling into a river, they were being trained to believe that black bodies do not register trauma the way white bodies do. It was a mechanism to absolve the dominant society of its guilt for the brutal conditions imposed upon the black community. Hal Roach took this vile historical blueprint and mapped it perfectly onto the body of Alan Hoskins. He refined it for the silver screen. Alan was the ultimate living embodiment of the Pickaninny. In contrast, white children like Mickey Daniels or Joe Cobb were allowed distinct personalities. They are the leaders, the bullies, the romantic leads. They wear overalls or suits. They are allowed to be children. Alan is restricted entirely to the role of the terrified, confused subordinate. He is the visual punchline. His mere presence in the frame, with his tattered dress and gravity-defying hair, is designed to elicit a laugh before he even moves a muscle. The system is incredibly efficient. The studio executives sit in their screening rooms, watching the dailies. They see the young boy in the dress, crying as a dog barks at him. They do not see a child in distress. They look at the screen and see a flawless execution of the Pickaninny formula. They see pure, untaxed profit. They know that theaters across the country, from New York to the deep segregated South, will pay top dollar for this exact image. The executives do not care about the long-term mental health of the boy in the dress. They care about the syndication rights. They care about the international distribution deals. The machine's success relied entirely on its audience. Millions of tickets are sold. The theaters are packed. Families sit in the dark, watching a black toddler being stripped of his gender and humiliated for their amusement, and they roar with laughter. Why? What is happening in the minds of the viewers? They are engaging in a collective act of supremacy. Watching Farina confirms their worldview. It allows them to look at the brutal racial hierarchy outside the theater doors and feel that it is justified, even natural. If black children are truly this wild, this absurd, this close to animals, then the system of segregation is not a crime. It is simply the natural order of things. Alan Hoskins becomes the most famous black child on the planet by validating the worst instincts of the white majority. He is carrying the psychological weight of an entire nation's racism on his tiny, fragile shoulders. He is generating immense wealth for a system that fundamentally despises him. He is the engine of the Hal Roach studio, pulling in revenue that builds mansions and buys yachts for the men who order him to put on the ragged dress every morning. Yet despite the overwhelming oppression of this environment, the undeniable reality of Alan's talent begins to break through the racist constraints. This is the tragic paradox of his early life. The studio builds a cage for him, but inside that cage he is brilliant. Even bound by the genderless clothing and the degrading scripts, his natural timing is impeccable. He understands the camera intuitively. He knows how to hold a pause. He knows how to look into the lens and convey a silent, profound exhaustion that is far beyond his years. The audience laughs at the Piccanini, but they are also mesmerized by the performer. He becomes the anchor of the series. Directors realize that if a scene is failing, they can simply cut to Alan for a reaction shot, and it will save the sequence. He is reliable. He is professional. He is a workhorse in a toddler's body. Because of this undeniable skill, his salary begins to climb. The studio recognizes his commercial value, even if they refuse to recognize his humanity. By the mid-1920s, he is earning an exorbitant amount of money. He is the highest paid star in the Our Gang cast. He brings home a weekly paycheck that would take an average industrial worker months to earn. This money creates a complex, suffocating dynamic for his family. The financial rewards are too massive to walk away from. The Hoskins family goes from struggling in a segregated city to having a steady, lucrative income. But this money is blood money. It is the price the studio pays to rent their child's dignity. The parents are caught in a brutal economic hostage situation. If they demand better treatment for Alan, if they ask the studio to stop putting him in dresses, they risk losing the income that keeps a roof over their heads. The studio holds all the leverage. They can replace Alan tomorrow with another desperate black child. The system relies on this desperation. It weaponizes the family's poverty against the child's well-being. So the boy goes to work, day after day, year after year. He walks through the studio gates, takes off his own clothes, and steps into the ragged dress of the caricature. He sits in the chair while adults pull his hair into tight, painful knots. He walks onto the set and listens to men call him she and it. He performs the fear, the ignorance, the subservience required by the script. He does this while his body is secretly growing, while his mind is expanding. while he is slowly beginning to understand the mechanics of his own exploitation. The studio believes they have created a perfect, perpetual motion machine of profit. They have a brilliant performer locked inside a foolproof, historically tested racist caricature. They assume this will last forever. They view Alan not as a growing boy, but as a static asset, a piece of intellectual property that they own entirely. They do not anticipate that biology will eventually intervene. They do not realize that the human body cannot be permanently paused. For now, the system operates smoothly. The cameras keep rolling, the theaters keep laughing, the bank accounts of the studio executives continue to swell. But on the set, beneath the bright, hot lights, the physical reality of the job is becoming increasingly brutal. The psychological abuse of identity theft is about to be compounded by a relentless campaign of physical endangerment. The studio has established that Alan is not fully human in their eyes. Soon, they will begin to treat his physical safety with the exact same level of disregard. The Pickaninny is not just a visual joke, it is a target. And the men behind the cameras are about to load the ammunition. Extracting value from Alan Hoskins required more than psychological humiliation. It demanded his physical suffering. The environment of a silent comedy set in the 1920s was inherently chaotic. The genre was slapstick. It relied on kinetic energy, violent collisions, and physical peril to generate laughter. For adult stuntmen, this was a calculated risk. For a black toddler, it was an arena of constant, unmitigated danger. These comedic setups relied on visceral reactions. The directors of our gang needed the character to look authentically terrified, because in their racist framework, the natural state of a black child was supposed to be a panicked, wide-eyed frenzy. You cannot always act that level of fear, especially not when you are 3 years old. The most efficient way to capture genuine terror on film is to actually terrify the subject. Alan Hoskins was subjected to conditions that today would immediately result in criminal prosecution. The studio frequently used live, highly trained animals in their comedic setups. They used large dogs, mules, and sometimes even exotic animals. The scripts frequently called for Farina to be chased, cornered, or attacked by these animals. The footage of this tiny child running from a massive dog, scrambling over fences, or falling face first into the dirt is not a performance. It is the raw, unfiltered survival instinct of an infant. His adrenaline was real. His tears were real. The studio executives knew exactly what they were doing. They placed his physical safety at the absolute bottom of their priority list. A film reel was expensive. The bodily integrity of a black child laborer was cheap. If a stunt required him to fall out of a moving wagon, he fell. If a scene required him to be shoved violently by older children, he was shoved. The crew did not employ sophisticated safety harnesses or protective padding for him. The ragged dress he was forced to wear offered zero protection against the hard, dusty ground of the studio backlot. He was a human crash test dummy for a comedy franchise. This physical endangerment was applied with a sickening double standard. While the white child actors certainly participated in the rough and tumble action, there was a discernible line drawn regarding their safety. The white children were the protagonists. They were the architects of the mischief. Alan, bound by the rigid rules of the Picanini stereotype, was almost always the victim of the mischief. He was the target of the exploding props. He was the one left behind, in the burning barn. He was the one suspended by his clothes over a dangerous drop. The physical violence was disproportionately directed at his body, reinforcing the cultural message that black flesh was impervious to pain and fundamentally disposable. Every time the director yelled action, Allen was stepping into a combat zone where his only defense was his ability to endure. He learned to take a punch, to take a fall, and to immediately stand back up and deliver the required punchline. This is a staggering level of resilience for a child, but we must not romanticize it. Resilience born of abuse is still abuse. The studio was weaponizing his childhood against him, turning his natural vulnerability into a spectacle of suffering for the amusement of a segregated nation. As the years progressed, the physical toll compounded. He was working exhausting hours under hot, blinding studio lights. The mental strain of constantly navigating this hostile, dangerous environment while maintaining a perfect comedic rhythm is unimaginable. Yet, he delivered. He carried the franchise on his bruised shoulders. The financial structure reveals the ultimate motive for this systemic crime. In the context of the 1920s, this was a fortune. It was a sum that effectively trapped his parents, forcing them to turn a blind eye to the daily abuse their son suffered. The studio proudly publicized his salary. They used it as proof of their own benevolence. They wanted the public to believe that they were rescuing a black family from poverty. But a studio contract in the silent era was not an instrument of mutual benefit. It was a legal trap designed by corporate lawyers to ensure that the laborer owned nothing but their weekly wage, while the studio owned the universe. The Hoskins family, lacking powerful legal representation and desperate for income, signed away every conceivable right to Allen's image, his likeness, and the fruits of his labor. They did not understand the concept of intellectual property because the industry itself was still inventing it. But Hal Roach and his executives understood it perfectly. The studio paid Allen for his time on the set. They did not pay him for the value he created. They owned the character of Farina entirely. They owned the negatives. They owned the distribution rights in perpetuity. When Allen went home battered and exhausted at the end of the week, the transaction was considered legally complete. But the economic life of his performance was just beginning. Decades later, a technological revolution occurred that the Hoskins family could never have predicted. Television was invented. The massive archives of silent and early sound films became a goldmine for broadcasters desperate for cheap content. The Hal Roach studio packaged the Our Gang comedies and sold them into the Levision syndication under the title The Little Rascals. These films blanketed the airwaves in the 1950s, 1960s, and beyond. They were broadcast in every living room in America. They were sold internationally. They generated millions upon millions of dollars in pure, unadulterated profit for the studio executives, their heirs, and the corporate entities that purchased their catalogs. Allen Hoskins, the child who took the falls, who wore the ragged dress, who endured the dogs and the psychological torment, was the undisputed star of those syndicated reels. His face helped drive a massive new wave of wealth. However, like all child actors of the silent era, regardless of race, he did not receive a single penny in television residuals. The legal framework of the 1920s simply did not account for future technologies. The system capitalized on his childhood trauma to build empires in the 1950s, leaving the primary architect of that success entirely severed from its profits. But the machinery of Hollywood as powerful as it was, had a fatal flaw. They could write the contracts. They could build the sets. They could enforce the racist stereotypes, but they could not control time. They viewed Alan Hoskins as a static asset, a piece of machinery that would perform the same function indefinitely. They forgot that the machinery was made of flesh and blood. They forgot that the child was going to grow. The plot twist arrives in the year 1931. Alan Hoskins is 11 years old. This is the moment the biological reality of human development collides violently with the artificial constraints of the studio system. Puberty is a natural, unstoppable force. For most children, it is a confusing but ordinary transition. For a child trapped in a racist Hollywood caricature, it is a professional death sentence. The entire premise of the Farina character, the genderless, helpless, frantic Piccanini, relied fundamentally on Alan being small, soft, and childlike. The illusion only worked as long as he appeared physically inferior and completely unthreatening to the white audience. At 11 years old, Alan's body begins to rebel against the costume. He experiences a sudden growth spurt. He shoots up in height, quickly towering over the younger white actors on the set. His shoulders begin to broaden. The muscles in his arms and legs develop definition. The cheap, tattered gingham dresses that used to swallow his tiny frame now stretch awkwardly across the physique of a developing young man. More alarmingly for the studio directors, his voice begins to crack and drop. The high-pitched squeals of terror that they relied upon for easy laughs are suddenly replaced by the deeper, resonant tones of an adolescent. The physical transformation is undeniable. He is no longer a genderless toddler. He is unmistakably a young, strong, black male. Panic sets in at the Hal Roach studio. The executives look at the daily footage and realize that the formula is broken. A muscular black teenager standing in a dress next to small white children is no longer comedic to a 1930s audience. In fact, within the deeply racist psychology of the era, it is perceived as a threat. The system relies on the absolute subjugation and infantilization of black bodies. A black adolescent who exhibits physical strength and maturity destroys the comforting lie that the Picanini stereotype was built to maintain. The studio faces a choice. They have a brilliant, experienced comedic actor who has faithfully carried their franchise for nearly a decade. A moral or artistic institution would look at this growing boy and write new material for him. They would develop his character, allow him to mature on screen, and transition him into adolescent roles that respect his talent and his humanity. But Hollywood in 1931 is neither moral nor artistic. It is a factory. And when a part no longer fits the machine, you do not redesign the machine. You discard the part. There are no meetings held to discuss Len's future. There is no strategy to elevate his career. The decision is swift, cold, and absolute. They fire him. The psychological whiplash was absolute. Alan Hoskins has spent his entire conscious life inside the walls of the Hal Roach studio. He does not know a reality where he is not performing. He has sacrificed his normal childhood, his physical safety, and his own identity to serve this institution. He has brought them immense wealth and global fame, and in return, the moment his biology makes him inconvenient, the gates are locked behind him. There is no severance package. There is no psychological counseling to help an 11-year-old boy transition from being an international superstar to a discarded civilian. There is no gratitude. The studio severs the contract and simply walks away, leaving Alan and his family in a terrifying freefall. The massive weekly paychecks stop instantly. The economic lifeline is cut. The cruelty of the system is immediately highlighted by their next move. The studio does not mourn the loss of Farina. They simply replace the component. They recognize that the Piccanini formula is still highly profitable. They just need a smaller, younger body to fill the ragged clothes. They scour the Los Angeles area and find Matthew Beard, a young black child, whom they quickly brand as Stymie. They put the new boy in oversized, dilapidated clothing. They give him a massive, battered derby hat. They instruct him to act confused, subservient, and perpetually hungry. The machine restarts without missing a beat. The casting of Matthew Beard is the final, definitive proof that the studio never saw Alan Hoskins as a human being. He was merely the first iteration of a disposable template. They took the formula that destroyed Alan's childhood and immediately applied it to the next available victim. Alan Hoskins is suddenly standing outside the studio system, a famous face with no future. He is 11 years old, entering the brutal reality of the Great Depression, carrying the deep, invisible scars of a decade of psychological and physical exploitation. The system has chewed him up, extracted every dollar of his childhood innocence, and spat him out onto the segregated streets of America. But the story of Alan Hoskins does not end in the gutter. The machine expected him to fade away, to become another tragic statistic of child stardom. They severely underestimated the profound, quiet strength of the young man they had just discarded. The battle for his soul is over, but the battle for his dignity is about to begin. The transition from international superstar to discarded civilian is a brutal psychological process for any human being. For an 11-year-old black boy in America at the height of the Great Depression, it was an economic exile. The Hal Roach studio did not simply terminate a contract. They severed his only connection to the world he had known since he was 14 months old. He was thrust out of the insulated, highly controlled environment of the studio backlot and into a society that was collapsing under the weight of financial ruin. His family, who had grown entirely dependent on the massive weekly paychecks generated by his exploitation, suddenly faced the terrifying reality of poverty. The money stopped, but the fame remained. This is the unique, localized hell of the discarded child star. Alan Hoskins walked the streets of Los Angeles and people recognized him. They pointed at him. They expected him to be the wild, genderless toddler in the tattered dress. They did not understand why he was growing, why his voice was deep, or why he was not smiling. To survive the immediate financial crisis, Alan and his younger sister Janny were forced into the grueling world of vaudeville. The studio system had abandoned him, so he turned to the stage. They toured the country, traveling through a deeply segregated landscape, sleeping in substandard accommodations, and performing live comedy out teens. The audience in these theaters did not want to see Alan Hoskins, the developing young actor. They demanded the ghost of Farina. They paid their admission to see the Pickaninny caricature. Night after night, Alan was forced to resurrect the very stereotype that had stolen his childhood. He had to artificially pitch his voice higher. He had to mimic the frantic, terrified expressions he had been forced to make as a toddler. He was trapped in a macabre pantomime of his own abuse, performing an imitation of an imitation just to afford train fare to the next town. The psychological toll of this repetition is staggering. He was a young man being forced to play the role of a degraded infant in order to eat. Vaudeville, however, was a dying industry, rapidly being killed by the very motion pictures Alan had helped popularize. As he moved through his teenage years, the stage work dried up. He was no longer a child, and he could no longer believably perform the Farina routine. He was a veteran performer with over a decade of high-level experience in the entertainment industry. He possessed an intuitive, encyclopedic knowledge of comedic timing, camera placement, and stage presence. By any logical metric of meritocracy, he should have been transitioning into a lucrative career as a leading man or a highly respected character actor. So in the late 1930s, as a young, articulate adult, he decided to confront the Hollywood machine once again. He wanted to work. He wanted to practice his craft. He walked back into the casting offices of major studios. He did not ask for charity. He presented himself as a seasoned professional, ready for dramatic roles. But the system he walked into was not broken. It was operating exactly as designed. The Hollywood of the 1930s and 1940s was entering its so-called golden age. For white actors, it was an era of unprecedented glamour, complex storytelling, and financial reward. For black actors, it was a closed fortress guarded by impenetrable walls of racial stereotyping. The industry was strictly governed by the production code, a set of moral guidelines that mandated how life could be depicted on screen. In the context of Jim Crow America, these guidelines effectively demanded that the racial hierarchy of white supremacy remain unchallenged in every frame of film. When the casting directors looked at Alan Hoskins, they experienced an immediate cognitive dissonance. They saw a strong, dignified, intelligent black man, but the scripts sitting on their desks had no space for a human being of his description. The Hollywood machine only manufactured 3 distinct templates for black men. You could play the terrified, superstitious buffoon who rolled his eyes and shook at the sound of thunder. You could play the docile, uneducated servant who existed only to orbit and comfort the white protagonists. Or you could play the silent, invisible laborer in the background. There were no scripts about black doctors, black detectives, or black heroes. The industry refused to manufacture any image that might suggest to the American public that a black man was capable of leadership, courage, or intellectual depth. The studio executives handed Alan these scripts. They expected him to be grateful. They expected the desperate economics of his situation to override his basic human dignity. They asked him to step back in front of the camera and portray characters who were fundamentally inferior. They wanted him to speak in a heavy, fabricated dialect that he did not use in his actual life. They wanted him to stoop his shoulders, avert his eyes, and play the fool. They did not ask him to act, they asked him to surrender. They were demanding that he participate in the systemic degradation of his own people in exchange for a meager paycheck. This is the precise moment where Alan Hoskins transformed from a victim of the system into a threat against it. He read the scripts, he looked at the roles they were offering him, and he made a choice that required a level of psychological fortitude most people will never possess. He said no. He refused to take the roles. He recognized that while the studios had physically stripped him of the ragged dress, they were simply offering him an adult version of the same humiliation. He understood the profound political power of the moving image. He knew that every time a black actor accepted a role as a mindless servant or a panicked buffoon, it validated the prejudice of millions of white viewers. It reinforced the invisible walls of segregation. It made it easier for society to deny black Americans equal housing, equal education, and equal rights because the screen constantly reassured the dominant culture that black people were exactly where they belonged. Alan Hoskins refused to be the tool they used to build that narrative. He chose to starve rather than sell his honor. The Hollywood machine does not tolerate defiance, especially from those it considers subordinate. When Alan Hoskins rejected these degrading roles, he was not viewed as an artist, standing up for his principles. He was labeled as difficult. In the ruthless mathematics of studio casting, a black actor who refused to play a stereotype was a liability. The retaliation was silent, swift, and absolute. They did not issue a public statement. They did not fire him loudly. They simply executed a shadow ban. His name was crossed off the casting lists. The phone stopped ringing. The gates to the studios, the very gates he had helped to build with his childhood labor, were locked against him forever. He was effectively blacklisted from the American entertainment industry, not because of any political affiliation or criminal act, but because he demanded to be treated as a dignified adult. By the early 1940s, the global landscape shifted violently. World War II consumed the planet. Like millions of other young men, Alan Hoskins joined the armed forces. The profound irony of this cannot be overstated. He stepped out of an industry that refused to recognize his humanity and entered a military machine that was strictly segregated by race. He was asked to put his life on the line to fight against fascism and tyranny abroad, while wearing the uniform of a country that actively enforced an apartheid system at home. Yet, he served. He served honorably in the Pacific Theater. This is a testament to the core integrity of the man. The country had abused him, exploited him, and discarded him, but he still chose to fulfill his duty. He demonstrated a caliber of citizenship and courage that far exceeded the moral capacity of the men who had run the Hal Roach studio. When the war ended, Alan Hoskins returned to a California that was rapidly changing. The post-war economic boom was in full swing, but more importantly, a new technological revolution was taking over the American living room: television. The studios, sitting on vast archives of old film, realized they had a new, wildly lucrative market. They began packaging their silent and early sound shorts and selling them to local television stations across the country. The Our Gang comedies, now rebranded as The Little Rascals, became a daily staple of afternoon broadcasting. This created a surreal and deeply painful reality for Alan. As a young civilian trying to rebuild his life after a world war, he was suddenly famous all over again. A completely new generation of American children was sitting in front of the television every day, laughing at the tattered dress, the wild pigtails, and the fabricated terror of Farina. His image was everywhere. His childhood was being broadcast directly into millions of homes, generating massive, unprecedented profits for television networks, advertising agencies, and corporate executives. The intellectual property he had forged with his own sweat and tears was building empires. Yet, Alan Hoskins stood in the real world with empty pockets. Because of the predity, or contracts his parents were forced to sign when he was an infant, he did not possess a single legal claim to his own face. He was the undisputed star of the most successful syndicated child comedy in television history, and he was completely severed from its wealth. He had to walk down the street, perhaps looking for work or buying groceries, knowing that at that exact moment, his exploited childhood image was making strangers wealthy. The system had stolen his youth once to build a film studio in the 1920s, and now it was stealing it a second time to build the television industry in the 1950s. This is where the discarded child star, crushed by the weight of public fame and private poverty, turns to alcohol, drugs, or criminal behavior. The industry almost expects this outcome. It is a convenient narrative for the system because when a former star destroys themselves, society blames the individual. They point to the addiction or the public breakdown and say, "What a shame. He couldn't handle the pressure." It is a psychological defense mechanism that allows the public and the studio executives to avoid looking at their own complicity. They want the victim to fail because a failed victim proves that they were never strong enough to succeed anyway. But Alan Hoskins refused to give them that satisfaction. He completely rejected the script of the tragic, self-destructive child star. He did not grant interviews complaining about his lost wealth. He did not show up at studio gates begging for minor roles. He understood that the only way to truly defeat a system designed to crush your dignity is to build a dignified life entirely outside of its reach. He walked away from the camera, away from the spotlight, and into the harsh, unglamorous reality of the real world. He looked for a profession that had absolute, undeniable meaning. He underwent rigorous training and education to enter the medical field. He chose to become a psychiatric technician. He was employed by the state of California, working in massive psychiatric hospitals. He traded the artificial, chaotic environment of the film set for the sterile, difficult environment of the mental health ward. This career choice carried profound philosophical weight. Alan Hoskins, a man who had been subjected to intense, organized psychological abuse from the time he was 14 months old, chose to spend his adult life caring for people whose minds had broken. He had been used as a human prop, repeatedly terrified and humiliated for the amusement of a racist society. He knew intimately what it felt like to be entirely vulnerable, to be stripped of agency, and to be treated as less than human by an institutional authority. Instead of letting that trauma poison him, he weaponized it into empathy. His daily work was grueling. He walked the halls of institutions housing the forgotten, the traumatized, the severely addicted, and the violently psychotic. These were the people that post-war American society wanted to hide away, just as they had wanted to hide away the reality of racial inequality. Alan Hoskins did not look away. He bathed them, he fed them, he restrained them when necessary, not with the cruelty of a Hollywood director, but with the necessary firmness of a medical professional committed to their safety. He sat with them in their darkest, most terrifying moments. He offered them the precise thing the Hollywood machine had actively denied him: basic, unconditional human respect. He worked in these hospitals for decades. He was a quiet, stable presence in an environment defined by chaos. He earned a modest government salary. He married, raised a family, and lived in the sprawling suburbs of Los Angeles. His neighbors likely knew him simply as Mr. Hoskins, the medical technician who went to work early and came home tired. They did not immediately connect the dignified, aging black man with the frantic, tattered child they watched on their televisions every afternoon. D successfully bifurcated his existence. The system owned Farina, but Alan Hoskins owned himself. This period of his life is not a footnote. It is the central proof of his victory. The Hollywood system attempted to manufacture a subhuman creature out of his childhood. They attempted to starve his adulthood when he refused to comply with their racist demands. They successfully stole millions of dollars of his labor, but they utterly failed to capture his soul. His decades of service in the psychiatric wards are a monumental act of defiance. Every patient he comforted, every shift he completed, was a silent repudiation of the executives who believed he was nothing more than a profitable joke. He proved that his capacity for compassion and his dedication to human life were vastly superior to the men who ran the entertainment empire. He became the hero they never allowed him to play on screen. The final and perhaps most violent weapon in the entertainment industry's arsenal is not a bad contract, a degrading script, or even physical endangerment. It is absolute manufactured amnesia. We often mistake the disappearance of public figures for a natural fading of fame. We assume that audiences simply move on, that tastes change, and that the spotlight naturally drifts to the next generation. That is a comforting fiction. When it comes to individuals who challenge the fundamental power structure of Hollywood, they do not merely fade away. They are actively, systematically erased. The massive cultural paradox that defined the final decades of Alan Hoskins' life reveals the mechanics of this erasure. As he moved through the 1960s and into the 1970s, the United States was undergoing a seismic, violent racial reckoning. The civil rights movement was dismantling the legal frameworks of Jim Crow. Black Americans were marching in the streets, demanding voting rights, equal housing, and the basic recognition of their humanity. The country was supposedly waking up. The media was broadcasting footage of protests, political assassinations, and sweeping legislative changes. The dominant narrative was that society was progressing. Yet simultaneously, in the quiet, air-conditioned living rooms of that exact same society, the television networks were executing a massive counter-programming strategy. Every afternoon, while the evening news prepared to show riots and political unrest, the syndication packages of the old silent comedies were broadcast to millions of children. The networks were intentionally pumping the Piccanini caricature back into the cultural bloodstream. They were selling a daily nostalgic dose of a safe, segregated, and deeply racist past to a white American public that was anxious about the rapidly changing present. Alan Hoskins was living in the crosshairs of this massive psychological contradiction. He was a dignified black man in his 50s, living in a country that was supposedly moving toward equality, yet every time he walked past a television set, he saw his own stolen childhood being used to reinforce the exact stereotypes his community was fighting and dying to destroy. The character of Farina, the genderless, terrified, ragged creature he was forced to inhabit, was immortalized in a continuous, endless loop. The film negative does not age. The caricature does not grow up. The system had successfully trapped his infant body in amber, preserving the abuse for all time and making it available for daily mass consumption. This was a unique form of psychological torture. His most degrading developmental moments were recorded, packaged, and sold for half a century, while he possessed zero legal authority to stop it. He could not send a cease and desist letter. He could not demand a share of the advertising revenue. The corporate entities that owned the rights to his face possessed a legal shield that was entirely impenetrable. They had purchased his dignity in the 1920s at a severe discount, and they were legally permitted to exploit it until the end of time. During these years, the media occasionally attempted to locate former child stars for "Where are they now?" retrospective articles. The press loves a tragedy. They love to point their cameras at the broken remnants of early fame. They tracked down some of his former co-stars, capturing stories of financial ruin, addiction, or desperate attempts to cling to the periphery of the business. But Alan Hoskins fundamentally rejected their narrative. He did not offer himself up for their consumption a second time. He did not grant tearful interviews about how the studios robbed him. He did not write a sensationalized memoir detailing the abuse on the Hal Roach lot. He understood that the journalistic establishment was not interested in justice. They were interested in spectacle. If he spoke out, they would simply frame him as a bitter, failed actor. They would not indict the corporate structure that built the trap. They would blame the boy who was caught in it. So he chose the only defense mechanism the system could not penetrate: total, absolute silence. He gave them nothing. He went to his job at the psychiatric hospital. He cared for his patients. He lived his private life. He denied the media the satisfaction of seeing him bleed. But this powerful, dignified silence gave the industry the exact cover it needed to execute its final crime. Because he refused to play the role of the broken victim, the system decided it was best to simply pretend he never existed. As the 1970s drew to a close, the physical toll of his long, grueling life began to manifest. The man who had survived the chaotic, dangerous film sets of the silent era, who had survived the racial hostility of a segregated nation, and who had survived the brutal theaters of World War II, was finally confronted with an enemy he could not outlast. He was diagnosed with cancer. Cancer is a quiet, methodical, and deeply intimate dismantling of the human body. For a man who had spent decades in the medical field, meticulously caring for the broken bodies and minds of others, the transition to becoming the patient must have been a profound reckoning. He spent his final months in a medical facility in California, far removed from the glare of the flashbulbs and the orchestrated chaos of the entertainment industry. He faced the end of his life with the same quiet, uncompromising dignity that he had utilized to survive it. He was not surrounded by studio executives. He was not flanked by publicists. He was a private citizen fighting a private war. On July 26, 1980, Alan Hoskins died of cancer. He was 59 years old. When the white architects of the silent film era died, the media halted. They received front-page obituaries and global tributes. When Alan Hoskins died, the machine produced nothing. The death of the most recognizable black child star in cinema history was met with absolute, coordinated silence. This was not a journalistic oversight. It was an act of corporate self-preservation. To publish his obituary was to admit the truth. To explain his fame was to confess to the systemic abuse that built American comedy. The networks could not mourn the man without destroying the lucrative syndication of the child. So, they chose the coward's path. They wiped his name from the ledger. They hoped his human existence would evaporate, leaving behind only the profitable ghost of Farina. But the erasure failed. The grainy footage can no longer be viewed with ignorance. The laughter was built on degradation, but his spirit remained unbroken. He rejected an industry that demanded he play the fool, choosing instead a life of profound service to the forgotten. His name was never Farina. His name was Alan Hoskins. He was a veteran, an artist, and a healer.